Alright, we managed to kind of get in a bit of a full week, so let's go into the four movies that came to us this week, or was pretty much on their way out that I had to catch at the very last minute. Um, we're going to start with A Quiet Place, which is a movie that's had a whole lot building around it since like the first trailer came out, or even the concept really, of not just the fact that it was going to be John Krasinski and Emily Blunt working together for the first time, but in this movie with this really striking concept involving creatures that hunt you strictly by sound, which means everything must be totally and completely dead silent. Kind of taking this almost like an intentional grab at the horror trope in itself, of the whole, usually horror movies tend to be loud, but then you know they're going to get even louder once there's that kind of quiet portion. Right when the sound goes out, or the score goes out, or whatever. So now the whole concept of the movie is that portion of the no sound before the giant thing happens. Which I guess a lot of people were concerned was going to just make it like a jump scare factory, is the exact term I saw. But the interesting thing that he does here is, I was doing a lot of reading on exactly what his approach was going to be, because I was really curious. Because I had heard, like, when the trailers came out, it was getting comparisons to, like, It Comes at Night, which was exciting, but then I thought it was even more interesting when I learned that, much as I loved It Comes at Night, obviously, that he had said something about finding inspiration more so in movies like 10 Cloverfield Lane and Don't Breathe. So that was equally exciting, especially with this setup. More like, because with this setup you sort of think, and with the It Comes at Night comparisons, you sort of think it might be going in kind of a bit of that whole kind of art house horror direction we've been going. The whole kind of don't show the monster phase we've been going through. But yes, it does very much feel like, obviously it was produced by Michael Bay, who Krasinski worked with on 13 Hours. But yeah, it does kind of feel mostly like an actual, big produced studio movie, but actually has, like, kind of the best portions of what those art house horror movies bring, and kind of almost feels like a mesh of the two. And there was obviously the whole thing about making sure you're in a theater with, like, no sound whatsoever, because obviously moviegoers tend to be a bit restless, especially for horror movies. But funny enough, the worst problem when it came to this was that Ready Player One was next door, and you could hear the race scene clear as day about 10 minutes into the movie. But once that passed, it was pretty much fine, and that didn't detract too much, because there was the whole thing where he said that Krasinski had said that he didn't want it to seem like some experiment, or like some kind of, silent thing. So it's like, you kind of imagine there's going to be these long stretches of just absolute silence, but there's a score that's almost constant, which helps it feel more, kind of gives it more of a cinematic feel, but also kind of keeps it from being, like I guess from keeping, like, most moviegoers from getting that kind of restless feel, and managing to keep them engaged without it being too overbearing or anything like that. But like the score at the beginning, maybe it was Blunt in my subconscious, but it was like, when the score first plays at the very beginning, I at first thought it was The Beast, which was basically like the theme to Sicario, more or less. So it's like that, so it is effective in itself. But there are certainly those moments, especially this opening scene, where it is played to total silence once we've had the, opening logos and all that. There's that scene at the very beginning when it's, like, been on for maybe a minute and a half or 2 minutes, and they're in this store that's been abandoned, and Blunt is looking through these prescription bottles, and they're just lined up, standing next to each other, and it means nothing in the context of the movie. This amounts to nothing, but the way she just moves one bottle, and it, like, brushes up and nudges against another, I felt myself flinch just at that. So I kind of knew right then that this was going to be, should it play out like this, this will be a really effective concept if they can keep it up. So that, and there's also these little details in there also, like when you see in that store, there's like all the stuff has been like raided or taken out, whatever, and you can look around at some of the remaining items, and it's like the loud shit, like bags of chips, are like in full stock still, where everybody was smart enough to not take those. So I really like that kind of stuff, and there's also the more obvious things like how they play Monopoly, but all the pieces are like things that don't make noise that are much softer. And so you always kind of keep an eye out for that stuff once you see that towards the beginning, which is always fun. Um, but talking about the characters here, well, we don't really go beyond these four, or four and a half, really, where it's like, I don't know that it has like necessarily like a chamber piece feel, but it's one of those cases where you don't really realize till after you've really thought about it. Yeah, there's very few characters in this. There's every now and then somebody might show up briefly, but for the most part it's just these four, who are obviously Blund and Krasinski, and then their children, who are Millicent Simmons from Wonderstruck, who is actually deaf, and the kid whose name I forgot that was in Suburbicon is the son. And yeah, their family dynamic here is a lot. This is one of those horror movies that actually realizes where its strengths are and where the strengths are in many other great horror movies, and its heart plays a big part in this. Like the emotion that comes from some of the circumstances, and it's not necessarily all the effect isn't just from the scares themselves. So that was something really important that they did quite well. And obviously I was concerned about Krasinski. This has been like misinterpreted a lot as his directorial debut. He's actually done two other movies. The Haulers, which is, one of those family drama movies. And back in 2009 he did Brief Interviews with Hideous Men, which is fucking garbage. So I was a bit concerned not just with that, but also I've had a really hard time taking him seriously as a serious actor, especially after 13 Hours. I just couldn't buy it, I guess. Despite how good he is in comedies, like, The Office, obviously, and It's Complicated, I thought he was really funny in. But he really does sell it here, and, like, there's not a whole lot of dialogue, but that obviously, the way they just have to use expression and sign language, they use really effectively, but also that makes it even more, like, you would think it would kind of take away from that effect when they do start talking, like, in a normal voice level. They find kind of clever ways to maneuver around that so that they can. But it really doesn't, like, it actually is even more impactful when we actually just hear him in his normal voice for that first time. And her also, and obviously, I don't think there's anything that Blunt can't do at this point, because and I think she does it like all in this movie, because there are moments where she actually has like a sense of humor that kind of balances out Krasinski's kind of constant stone face, and just like he's in constant survival mode. Where she has these expressions where she can, lighten up mood, or they have their Conjuring 2 dance scene. But then she can also be devastated, she can be terrified, she can be in excruciating pain, she could be in a shotgun-wielding badass. Just kind of all within the confines of this very short runtime, and just does it flawlessly, like she does most things. Yeah, I just, when you think that she can't get any better at her job, she goes and does shit like this, and just keeps getting better. So, that's definitely a huge plus here. And they also use, I was talking about the silences and stuff like that, but it's, also the way they use anticipation when eventually there's going to be cases where a noise is made and they have to anticipate if they've been heard by the creatures or not. And there's just that waiting period where you just listen for every sound you can in the distance. And you kind of also get to figure it out for yourself for the most part. Like, there's the moment towards the beginning when that happens and we're listening and we hear birds. and it was like, oh shit, birds, more noise. But then I realized quickly, it's like, oh yeah, birds are a good thing, because now they're distracted. So we're in the clear. So scenes like that really definitely work in the movie's favor as well. And yeah, there's going to be those moments that feel cheap and are very loud just for the sake of it. There's a couple of consecutive scenes involving raccoons that basically seem put in there, because that's the case where you see the days, which is another real effective thing since all this broke out, and we're on day like 473 or something, and you kind of start to think like, how did the raccoons survive this long? Especially when we see the follow-up scene, but yes, and there's also cases when there's a lot of, like, people grabbing each other and it being kind of a jump scare, and it's like, that kind of seems like a bad idea in this environment, to unexpectedly jerk somebody, because, they could react or scream or something else that they really probably should not be doing, but there are a few of those that you kind of hoping they weren't going to go there, but it's not excessive or anything. The movie does get loud, but for the most part, it's warranted. Like 90% of it, I would say, 85 to 90% of it is warranted. And after a while, like, we've had this long introduction where there's a lot of silence and there's a lot of him explaining to the kid what exactly is going on and how they can, like I said, maneuver around certain things. But once it reaches a certain point, then it's one of those movies that becomes like, it's big scene after big scene after big scene until the end. And it's like just constantly, putting them in another predicament one right after the other, and it hardly takes a breath after that. Even when it's taking a breath, there's still like this sense of urgency that they need to hurry up and make a decision of what they're going to do. So it does work very effectively, and it doesn't necessarily, like, that's what I was saying about how it takes there feels like there's a sliver of the kind of art house horror approach, but it doesn't slip into those cliches. It is really nice that they're not afraid at all to show the monsters, which is kind of refreshing these days. And then there's also in some of the detail, I don't know that I love their design with the way, but there are some things to where it was like just one small thing that would make me go, oh my god, I love that. Like when the big bathtub scene is happening, which by the way is probably like a horror classic in the making, that scene. And we see one of the creatures like grab the railing of the stairs. And I don't know why, I just really loved that. And then there's also, like, there's something, like, really unnerving about it, but at the same time it's like, well, it's practical for that creature to do that. But there's also, yeah, I mean, the exposition is done relatively well, but there's some cases where it also feels quite blatant, like the way he explains how they use the babbling brook and the waterfall to kind of to overshadow their noise, but for the most part, we just kind of have to look around, and like I said, you can kind of just piece the rest of it together yourself, which can be really rewarding, so I'm glad that he gave the audience kind of the room to do that themselves. It was scripted by a couple of other guys, and it's my understanding he kind of took that script and reworked a little bit, but they all three get the credit for it, so yeah, this was definitely... I do think, I heard him also say that he didn't particularly have an interest in horror movies, and how this was much more like he and Blunt basically living out their worst fears of their real-life children, which was the place for this, which also kind of shows you that it's basically more about its heart than anything else, regardless of all the horror happening. Yeah, so that really does come through. I started to get maybe a little too hyped, especially after all the reviews and the, the South by Southwest reaction, but, yeah, it's still really good stuff, and I really do think that he's we can put, Brief Interviews with Hideous Men behind us now, and, okay, maybe he does have a real strength behind the camera. I am interested to see what he's gonna do now. It's not like, I don't feel the way I felt about Joel Edgerton after I saw The Gift, It's not like to that extreme, but I am very curious of what else he can do now. Maybe this is just a fluke, or maybe he's got something on his hands if he wants to stay, and maybe not necessarily this genre, but in the kind of, you know, tension building area. That could be a number of things. So, yeah, and I'd say one more time, Blonde is perfect as always. Let's go on to Bloggers, which I initially wasn't going to see, but the reviews kind of won me over, and it was like, well, that's... I'm now more curious than anything else that this apparently might actually be worthwhile, and not just as a throwaway comedy. So, well, obviously our whole setup is that the three daughters of John Cena, Leslie Mann, and Ike Barinholtz are going to prom where they plan on losing their virginity, and they plan on stopping this from happening. And it's basically like, it's the vague concept of why him on their side, and on the girl's side, it's like, the setup obviously is American Pie, the whole, you know, lose your virginity pact, but it ends up playing out a lot more like a female version of Superbad, basically. Very much so, like, almost to a fault. Yeah, it feels like they were trying to do, like, a gender swap Superbad here, but, my mind was immediately open, and to see where they were going to go with these jokes, because obviously the raunchy comedy has felt very played out for a very long time, and every now and then those really good ones will slip through the cracks or whatever, like a Superbad, for instance. And I wasn't sure for a little bit with the opening. We have, like John Cena is, like, kind of a one-joke character, where he, and not just the dad that's, you know, daughter's growing up too fast or whatever, but because he's the big, muscly John Cena, it's basically one joke that he's, like, the most sensitive of them all, and the most emotional and all that. While, like, Barinholtz is kind of very passive about it, and Leslie Mann is doing the whole... Her and her daughter, basically, there wasn't, like, a father, so they're really super close, and she may be going off to college, and they're gonna have to be apart for the first time, all that stuff. It's very... And you kind of... Like, it's one of those cases where you can see... Like I said, with A Quiet Place, sometimes the emotion can really be the heart of the movie, regardless of what your genre is. But you can kind of tell this is going to be one of those comedies that's going to be as raunchy as possible until it tries to be all Iggy Sweet and stuff like that, and it may not always reach its goal effectively or convincingly. So it did feel very... The laughs felt a bit uneven, because the laughs that work really do work, but there's some that don't. There's a lot, especially in the first half, that aren't, like... For a movie like this, and usually this is fine, but for a movie like this, it feels really lacking. The entire first half is really lacking the laugh out loud jokes, or just any moment in general. And sometimes they do find a way. Like, obviously, with a raunchy comedy, it's gonna be, like, sex jokes from beginning to end, more or less. Just the question is how you handle those sex jokes. And, like, every now and then there's, like, a clever line, like when she's talking about, she hands her lube that's, like, coconut flavored, and she says, you know, the blowjobs will taste like Almond Joys, and she says, well, you know, at least they don't taste like mounds. I'd rather eat 10 dicks than a mound. It's like, okay, that play on words is a little clever, I suppose. But then it goes on, and, like I said, it's not even necessarily that it's, like, hit or miss. It's just, sometimes they're really big, and sometimes it's like, I see what you were doing there, and I acknowledge that. I don't think it's necessarily a bad joke, but it's a joke that exists. And that's all I can say about it. I don't really have the natural reaction to it that I probably should be. But then there'll just be something like, there is... Because the thing about it is, this is one of those comedies where the big... You can tell where the big jokes are supposed to be. Like, the really big moments, usually involving, like, physical humor or gross-out humor. And I didn't really feel like those were hitting. There's one scene, it's the first scene between... It's an exchange, if you want to call it that, between John Cena and Gary Cole. And I laughed till I was in tears. But then there is a scene later that's supposed to be, like, an infinitely bigger version of that. And it's just like... this is funny. It's a funny setup, and the way it plays out, it's like, yes, for this joke to be funny, this is what you would do. But I wasn't, like, actually laughing at it. But I could see that it was a well-constructed joke that made sense to go in the direction that it does. So that was... I don't know, it's hard to judge a comedy that way. It's hard to judge comedies in general, if they're not just completely suck ass. So, but for the most part, that's pretty much what it feels like. As I've often said about the Neighbors movies, Ike Barinholtz is easily the MVP of this movie. He has this way of his deliveries are like flawless, but there's also he has a way of doing things that like probably wouldn't work in other movies or wouldn't work if it was other characters. Like the way he references other things, like usually would be kind of eye roll worthy, because it's like, well, that's easy, just make a reference to another movie, repeat, and then your laughs will just come automatically. But the way he, like, just the way he says, have you seen Inferno with Tom Hanks? And he repeats the line, have you seen Inferno, like 5 times in a row until somebody hears them. And for some reason, that was hilarious to me. I guess because Inferno is just such a random choice, I suppose, because it's so incredibly forgettable, yet that was his go-to. That could be kind of the heart of that joke. And then the whole Fast and Furious thing. Like I said, it's pretty much all about his delivery that makes these work. And like I said, if it was another movie, another joke, another actor, probably wouldn't land, but he can make pretty much anything land. So I always love when he shows up in these comedies, and I'm really glad that he was like one of the major players in this one, instead of like the side character that he was in Neighbors. I would so prefer the Neighbors movies if he was the lead character instead of Rogan, but so yeah, that's what we have here. And it does kind of, and we do end up going into some pretty cliche territory, like, we get to do the same cliche twice with 2 different sets of characters, because I guess maybe if you want to point out anything that might be clever in this telling of this joke is the fact that, you would think that the parents and the children would line up, but the thing is like, the sensitive one that's kind of, more reserved than the others, are not the parent and the same parent and child in these lineups. It's Barinholtz's daughter in the girls group, but it's Cena in the parents group. But with both of them, it's the same old cliche. It's the Kristen Bell and Bad Moms cliche that goes back forever. The more reserved one, the one that's least wanting to do all this, is going to be the one that gets shit-faced drunk and shenanigans and all that shit. So that's, like I said, maybe it's because it's not a matchup with the parent and daughter. Maybe that's the joke on top of the cliche already, but I don't know. It still just felt really just the same old shit. And it does avoid being a party montage movie. I was a little worried about that given the setup. There were a couple places where it could have been, but they managed to just kind of stick to what the scene is, so that helps a lot. We're in a bad place if you have to commend a comedy for not going the party montage route when they clearly had the opening. But yeah, we do get into the stuff where there's gonna be gross out scenes, obviously, given the fact that there are a lot of parties in this movie. There's always going to be the projectile vomit scene. Always. I'm slowly getting used to it. But yeah, and then there's like I said, that kind of goes back into the big scenes, you can identify them, but they really don't hit the way some of the more effortless laughs came out. One thing I did like that they don't usually do in these movies is, especially with the setup, you kind of expect it to be that the dudes that they're going to prom with are going to be the stereotypical douchebag types. But that's definitely not the case here. They do make the one kid that was with Leslie Mann's daughter is very, like, bland and pretty much what you'd probably expect given the plot. But the other two, they actually try to make those guys funny. And for the most part, it works. That one guy in particular, I think, he seems like he took a lot of lessons from Russell Brand before he gave this performance. So, It's like imagine Caleb Landry Jones trying to be Russell Brand is basically what this kid is, if you can't imagine that. And there's like I said, it seems like the throwaway jokes work a lot more than the necessarily the big ones, like just the it doesn't even necessarily make a lot of sense sometimes, like when Leslie Mann's daughter mistakes American Beauty for a romantic comedy and just goes with that. And then the follow-up joke that her date says, like, he can't believe that she watched American Beauty all the way through. Not quite sure what those mean, those jokes exactly, but like I said, the smaller jokes seem to work a lot more than the really big stuff, because we're so used to the big stuff anymore. Like, movies have gone so big with their raunchy humor at this point, it's like there's really not a whole lot else we have to see. It's more so like it's like the second Gary Cole scene. It's all about the execution and what the setup is, where you can really make it work, even if you don't necessarily have a laugh out loud reaction to it. So there's a scene in American Pie 2 that I was kind of having flashbacks of during that scene, much as it works. But so yeah, I mean, it's fine, I guess. The critical acclaim is a bit lost on me, and I was kind of not much like I was fine with it when I left, but then the 20 minutes I had to sit in the theater before A Quiet Place started kind of had me saying like, yeah, I don't know now. Thinking back on it, there's a lot of I don't know. So once you think about it, it may not add up to a lot, but I mean, if you just go into a comedy and just want the jokes to work for you no matter how brief, you'll probably be fine. I imagine people will probably take to this pretty well, like weirdly the critics did, but yeah, it kind of, as it goes on, as the day goes on, I'm kind of wearing off of it a little bit, and there's basically too much of we've already seen this shit before, and the jokes aren't big enough or funny enough to really get us past that point and make it feel like it rises above that, because you can, do the same jokes and have a totally different outcome. Like, I was using Why Him as an example at the beginning, but obviously these jokes go way beyond a movie that's 2 years old, but that's just, since it's a recent example, that's where my mind went, I suppose. So, yeah, so that's what that is. It's fine, and it's funny for what it is, but it still just kind of feels like another one of those, just another raunchy comedy with not much else to add to what other movies have already done. So, our next movie is going to be Love, Simon, which is yet another movie about young love that's based on a popular book, which makes this is probably a lot better than it would sound, because based on that alone. But the thing about it is that I'm actually really behind on this, because I saw it at the very last minute. I had heard so many great things about it, and I had kind of kept meaning to get around to it, but I guess other things kept coming out, I guess. But yesterday was its last day, and so I managed to catch it just then, thankfully. So, when it begins, we do have this, once again, I'm playing catch-up here, so I may or may not talk like you have or haven't seen this, and it won't matter, but I'll just do this like I normally would. So, obviously, Simon is played by Nick Robinson, I think is his name. And I was kind of surprised to see such a great performance here, because this is the kid from, like, Jurassic World, The Fifth Wave, Everything. He's had a rough start to his very early career here, and this is definitely going to help him out significantly. Even though these movies, may have found, giant success or moderate success, but as an actor, this is a really big deal, because there are so many different things he has to do here. He has to basically play up the pain and confusion of being a closeted gay kid, but who's still in high school, but also there's a certain comedy factor to this movie that makes it kind of really charming, but also doesn't necessarily downplay those really serious elements about it. And he just really plays all of this perfectly. And that kind of I kind of noticed this, like, immediately in one of the opening scenes, when he goes outside and he sees the dude just working in the yard, and he basically tries to hit on him by complimenting his boots, just to basically get his attention, and then he basically cringes inside himself and leaves. And what I found really interesting about this was the fact that, obviously for a long time in comedies, if somebody was gay, that just in itself was a punchline. And that's almost the way you could see this scene playing out, and it's, especially since it's at the very start of the movie, and it's like, you see this, and the scene plays out as such, and then that's the comedic moment. But the thing is in another much lesser movie, the fact that he was gay would have been the punchline to that scene and that line. But obviously the punchline is just that he's awkward. Like, this is the scene in every other teen comedy where the guy goes to approach the unapproachable girl and makes a fool of himself. And it's the same thing, just it's a gay dude and some dude that's across the street. And they play it just like that, and there's no other emphasis on, oh, it's funny because he's gay or whatever. So it's really nice to see that we've really moved past that old thing, and into this new territory that this movie is just going to throw us right into, and not really feel a need to say, hey, you know, audiences, are you prepared for this or not? So that's nice. And it just plays up like any other, you know, teen getting himself caught up in a horrible scenario with mistaken identities of sorts, identities meaning a totally different thing in this, and yeah, but also does not shy away from the very serious aspects of it, and the very heartbreaking aspects of it. And for a while, you know, if there's one thing that took some getting used to, it was basically him meeting up with his friends, not having the obvious sort of supporting characters here, and it's like, okay, so I'm all for this movie, but I mean, if it's like, is it just hipsters being hipsters here, or is this just the introduction? It's pretty much just the introduction, and you do really tend to you really start to grow for these characters, but there's also some characters that are kind of whatever on the side. Like when I saw Tony Hale's name in the credits, I was basically able to pinpoint exactly the kind of character he was going to play, and yeah, that's exactly what it was. Sometimes it works, sometimes it's way too obvious. But the thing about this movie that just really works, though, is its charm goes a really long way. And there's also, because its story, it's a good story and it's a really good setup, and it does keep you constantly interested. Even if it's, you know, starting to turn more into the dramatic and sort of away from the comedy aspects. But the main problem is that I guess this goes like, it depends on the audience member how you see this, but giving it this whole mystery aspect of him trying to figure out who his secret pen pal is, who is also gay and within the school but is in the closet, that doesn't want to reveal his identity or know the identity of Simon. The fact that this mystery is laying around is you spend the whole movie just kind of looking for who that could be and trying to figure it out. Like, obviously Simon's already doing this, and we hear this through narration as well. I do like the really clever narration technique when we get his introduction at the start, and it sounds like just any other normal narration, but then later we learn it's actually the first letter that he wrote to Blue. That's really clever. But there's also just this whole thing of, I kind of just spent the movie really trying to piece it together and trying to, like, almost everything in the movie felt like an intentional misdirection to keep the mystery. And it's like you're just trying to pinpoint, like, every single thing the movie's trying to do to keep this secret hidden. And that can get a little distracting and maybe get you caring a little too much about that, when it should probably be more about the characters themselves and how they're handling all the situations. And so that can get a little overbearing, but once again, that probably just depends on the audience member. I'm sure there's probably some people that just maybe didn't even think about it, just kind of let the movie play out. So, and yeah, and it's funny in a number of ways. It can be clever, but it can also be stuff like, there is a spontaneous musical number in this movie, and it's one of the rare instances where that actually totally works within the context. And the bigger it gets, the funnier it is, just because of the reason we're even looking at it. as this "so what'll happen once everybody knows I'm gay" scenario. Um, but then, and there's also the clever sequence of the "what if people had to come out as straight" thing. There's a lot of really kind of like the comedy of it is so clever in some circumstances to where it's kind of like the movie really does feel fresh, because you always hear like these reviews for movies like this that seem like you know where they're going, but a lot of their claim is around how fresh they feel, but you always kind of go in thinking, yeah, but is it really going to be that? Because there's some movies that are considered like being this fresh new thing that's a new take on something, and it still ends up feeling like the same old shit. And I really like this movie did actually kind of embrace different things that it doesn't really feel like we've seen a million times over. But that's not to say they don't sometimes end up there. Like the whole segment when once we get to the third act, the conflicts do start to feel very, very cliche and very forced, regardless of the circumstances that got them to that point. It still feels very much like kind of unnecessary, or at least not to the degree that they do. How they really played up as like one of the ultimate conflicts of the whole movie, when this movie already has a clear conflict in it. We don't really need the whole "oh, my friends are mad at me" stuff. It's like this guy's got plenty of problems. But it does, when we do actually see him basically reach rock bottom where just everything has gone wrong and he just breaks down, it does still have an emotional potency to it that really comes through. Like I said, his performance is really what sells it a lot. And there's also, there's one character I kind of had trouble understanding where the makers of the movie were coming from with him, which is obviously Martin, the blackmailer. I wasn't really sure how to take this, because I never liked this fuck from the get-go. And he's obviously a clear, like, villain of sorts. Like, to go as far as to blackmail him, and he's, like, totally serious about it. Like, it would make sense if it was, like, I was almost waiting for the scene when he says, "I'm gonna blackmail you, and you have to, get her to like me." For him to say, like, he says, "Okay, I'll do it," but then he says, "Were you actually gonna release those?" And he's like, "Of course not, I'm not, like, a piece of shit or anything." But no, he really holds up his end here in regards to, "I will release your secret if you don't help me." And it's just really skeevy and really off. But the problem with this is that, okay, you can make him a villain or whatever, make him fucking Paul Walker and She's All That or something. But the problem here is that throughout the movie, it's like he's supposed to be just another comedy sidekick. And it's so weird. I mean, I know the whole thing is he has to be integrated into the friend group because that's part of the "or I'll blackmail you" thing, but it's still, the way they just play it off like he's this likable character, I started to get confused as to if the movie really wanted us to sympathize with him or not, especially in his big scene. And that's... Did you even have to question that is a real red flag in this movie. And secondly, I hope to God nobody sympathized with him regardless of the things that would transpire. So that was... And that they spent a lot of time on that just really wasn't doing the movie a favor. So that was unfortunate. But then, like I said, you've also got his family. I was getting flashbacks of like Stanley Tucci and Patricia Clarkson and Easy A, with Josh Duhamel and Jennifer Garner, who are really good in this. Like, you think Josh Duhamel and Jennifer Garner, you immediately think, oh, this must be some shitty romantic comedy or something. But apparently they put that in their past for this, and yeah, Jennifer Garner has a couple of really good scenes, especially with where her character's coming from. Has very interesting outlooks on this. And then there is, I guess without saying a whole lot, I never in a million years thought that Josh Duhamel would come that close to making me cry. It's like, if there was one actor I would have thought would never get me to almost that point, it would have been him. But he really pulled off those last couple of scenes, and leading up to that also, to make those scenes pay off. He just played really well. So that was, not that he's a bad actor like that he has been, but I just would not have expected that from him. So that's great. But then, so yeah, it definitely does come back together very well. And like I said, his performance really Rollins' performance really holds it together in a way that if it wasn't as strong, that these lower points of the movie might have weighed it down more. But he just constantly keeps it afloat, and the stuff that does work around him is only working as well. So, yes, overall, mostly very positive things to say about this. And it's nice that it's getting kind of all that attention that it does, because it does feel like, almost feels like it would, in another universe, it would be like one of those really small movies that barely anybody saw, that would barely get a release. And given its subject matter, like 5 years ago or so, it might have been that because of that. But yes, so it's nice to see a movie like this get that kind of success and show that you can still make, young romance movies that actually work this well and feel this fresh for the most part. So, yes. And then our last movie is going to be Outside In, which is Lynn Shelton's new movie. You might know her. She did Your Sister's Sister with Blunt. She did Hump Day, Laggies, Touchy Feely with Ellen Page, which wasn't as good as those others, but still worth checking out. And she's very much in this sort of indie vein, right in there with like the Duplass brothers, as you can see, among others. But she wrote this with Jay Duplass, the other brother, and he also stars in it as basically the main character. Despite the fact that it feels more like the Edie Falco show. It's Jay Duplass is more so the, I use protagonist lightly here, but he's the main character. And this is one of those movies where you just immediately have to come to terms with something. And I'm not really quite sure how the movie wants to go about it, because it's one of those cases where if you're going to be into this, you have to... The main character, it can be really hard to like. He's one of those characters where he's like... He seems like he's supposed to be sympathetic, but he's also, like, comes off really aggressive, really weird, and really uncomfortable. But then again, he plays a guy that's been in prison for, like, 20 years for a crime he didn't even do. And Edie Falco has basically done all the work and able to get him freed. So... and she's a former high school teacher of his who he's now in love with, as he tells her. Despite the fact that she's married and has a teenage daughter. So, and, yeah, just the way, and yeah, there is something interesting to his character in regards to watching him try to basically catch up with everything. Like, he's still got, like, a flip phone. He says retarded, just, willy-nilly, and Caitlin Deaver has to tell him, yeah, that's not really cool anymore. And he, sees internet videos for the first time, shit like that. So there is certainly something interesting about this character as the movie goes, but it's a rough story, and maybe that's intentional, but the thing about it, we'll go more into that after I've talked about everything else. I do think Edie Falco is really good in this. Like I said, she's basically the main attraction. She's definitely, it's her real subtle stuff that goes a long way, because her character's in the middle of a lot of stuff within this movie, not just dealing with all that other stuff, but her marriage and the fact that she's distant from her daughter, how she interacts with the people at work, and that's where she's at her best, where it's not really, you can piece a lot of things together by just watching her without having to be told a whole lot. Which is stuff that works a lot better than, like, the more dramatic stuff, like with her husband. The stuff where the drama's coming. The smaller stuff works a lot better than that, especially just in movies like this in general. And we do have an interesting cast throughout. Like I said, Caitlin Deaver is amazing. She's the one that I, like, by seeing her promote stuff is how I even learned that Lynn Shelton had made another movie, because I loved her so much in Laggies, her other movie with Shelton. And you also know her from Short Term 12, among many other things. And she's really, really good here as well. But then there's also Ben Schwartz as his brother, who, once again, you're kind of trying to decide early on who the unlikable characters in this are, and the line is very fine. And that's not always... That can certainly be an appealing trait, but it's not always in this scenario. It doesn't quite reach that. And then there's also Pamela Reed. I have no idea where she's been. I don't think I've seen her since the 90s. And Matt Malloy is one of her Edie Falco's co-workers. Matt Malloy is one of those actors where it's like, once you see him, it's like, yep, this movie had a $5 budget. So it's like, because he's always in those really small movies. Um, yeah, and to go on Diva a little bit more, her storyline is one of those ones that could have been really cliche and really obvious. Unfortunately, this movie does kind of reach that point eventually, to where eventually all the storylines do start to come together in a way to where it's like, yeah, I thought that might be where that was going. Um, but she keeps it interesting, starting with the fact that she kind of, gives her own little thing in regards, as well as the writing, into the teenage character. Like the moment when Edie Falco's finally confronting her and saying, like, did I do something to piss you off? Like, why are you acting like this? And she's just like, because I'm a teenager and this is just how this works. That's just what happens. And they just let that go after that, and it's like that perfectly explains that. Um, and what's interesting is when they form a friendship, it's the whole, Edie Falco's basically making this happen. She's basically making her hang out with him to kind of introduce him back to normalcy. But it's not one of those cases you would think it is, where it's like it feels like this really forced thing, where it's like she's rolling her eyes, she hates being around a weird dude, and she feels like she's being forced through this, but ultimately they're gonna win each other over and like each other and all that. It doesn't really feel like that. It feels very kind of organic with the way that their friendship is almost immediate, because like I said, it doesn't really start with that cliche. They kind of just like each other just kind of naturally immediately. And so when they hang out and the movie progresses, it feels natural as they go. So that feels much better in regards to where you would think that would go, and that shit we've seen a million times. But like I said, that's not necessarily to say they don't still end up in those obvious places. Um, Another problem with the movie that usually Sheldon's able to rise above, is because her movies obviously are very small, and so, but here it's almost like it feels a little too small. It feels a little too minor, um, and there's a lot of stuff that feels a bit underdeveloped, and it's one of those cases where maybe you can say it's one of those movies where it's one of those things where the story kind of takes a back seat and it's more of a character thing. But I mean, even so, there's plenty of character stuff here that doesn't quite feel like. Once again, the whole husband thing feels very underdeveloped. There's the whole thing about things. There's this whole kind of dark thing that kind of messes with the tone of the movie, to where it's like every time it seems like we're about to go in a direction that's related to the incident that happened, which is the reason he's in prison. Um, it's it like comes and then it goes for a really long time, and we only get like little snippets of it, and it doesn't really even add up to much of anything at all, and just never kind of bothers to go and explore those directions. It's just kind of there, and we get this real dark feel, but then it's gone, and the movie resumes as was, and it feels a little off balance when that happens, but that's not that often. Even though the fact that it doesn't happen often is still kind of my criticism here, so I don't know. It gets jumbled there. And what I was going on about at the beginning, the character that J.D. Bliss plays, the main character, feels inconsistent. Like, I mean, once again, yeah, he's living in a confusing world right now because he's been in prison for a while, but still, it's like, sometimes, like, at the beginning, it's like he's so aggressive and uncomfortable, but then there are other times where it's like he's really likable and like he's actually trying really hard. He's like a really understanding person. He's like appreciative of the help he gets and all that. And then can just go right back into insufferable. And it's very confused exactly how we're supposed to feel about this character. And given that he's pretty much the main character, that's a rough bit for the movie. But still, most of the time, though, especially kind of in the middle there when it's like Kayla Deaver's portion of it, and some of the stuff that Edie Falco's doing that really stands out, do make the movie rise above. And Shelton definitely does know what she's doing in this territory for sure. This is just kind of a small dip, but it's still okay. Like, if another lesser person had made this movie, it would be probably, like, these small kind of indie directors, this would be something really good on their resume, but because I like Shelton's other stuff so much more, this feels like it's, not quite up to there, but she's still in there, and that's really important on top of the stuff that does work, so it's fine. Like, it's definitely watchable, and there is something intriguing about it for the most part, but just overall, it does feel very minor, and it does feel like they could have gone in more directions and focused on more of certain things and less of others, but it's fine. So yes, I do think Mark Duplass probably could have sold this. He's a lot better of an actor than his brother, but probably because he's been in a lot more. But I would love to have seen him in this part because he probably could have really sold this in an interesting way. But Jay, not so much. So yes. So that's what we have. Next week we have Rampage, supposedly the wide release of Isle of Dogs. I won't hold my breath. I'll just wait and see what happens. And yeah, and then we'll be just a couple of weeks away from Avengers, I think. So all I have to look forward to. We're still in kind of this big movie territory, so we'll see what goes on. So until then,